Hello and welcome to the next of our full course lecture. This lecture is looking at external factors which companies will need to take into account when they're considering their strategy, their corporate strategy. So things that they'll need to think about before they set that strategy. The first thing the company will need to think about is, what is their mission? What is the purpose of the organization? Before you can decide what your strategy will be, you need to decide what you're there to do. So Drucker said that there are 4 things that the business needs to consider when they're thinking about what their mission is. The first thing is, what is the business? So that's really fundamental to deciding what the corporate strategy should be. What is the business? Secondly, what do customers value from that business? So what separates you from other businesses? Why do customers want to use you? What do they value about what you are providing for them? Thirdly, then, we're looking at what the business should be. So what should that business be? And lastly, we're asking, what will it be? So how do we make it what we want it to be? So when we ask all 4 of those questions, we can actually distill what the mission, the purpose of the organization is. We can then set that out in a mission statement. Now, this is just a brief general statement, and what it will do is set the purpose or aims of the organisation. Now, it shouldn't usually be focused on commercial values. It looks at what the business is actually there for, what its reason for being is. So, for example, Google has a mission statement of to organise the world's information and to make it universally accessible and useful. So it's brief, it's to the point, it states the purpose of what Google is there to do, and it's not focused on the commercial. It doesn't mention growth, profitability, anything like that. It's saying, why are we here? What are we here to do? So what this can do is give us a direction for our strategy. It can say what the goals are of the organisation, and ultimately we can set our objectives based on trying to attain those goals. So by having a clear, concise mission statement, we can always come back to that and say, does our corporate strategy fit in with the mission statement that we have as a business? So ultimately our mission statement, as I mentioned, is our reason for being, why we are there as a business, and we can fit our corporate strategy to ensure that we meet that mission statement. We need to then think about the objectives that we will set for the organisation. Now, when we set objectives, they should always be SMART. So looking at the little graphic we have in front of us, we can see that SMART means specific. So the goals should be very specific rather than general. They should be measurable. They need to be measurable because we need to assess whether our performance meets up to what we expected or how we expected it to happen. They need to be attainable. There's no point in setting objectives if they're not attainable, because that will demotivate our employees. They also need to be relevant. They need to try and achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve within the organisation. And they need to be timely, i.e. they need to be set in a way that we can achieve them within a set period of time. So when an organisation is setting goals and objectives, they need to make sure that they fit in with this. They need to make sure that they meet all of these requirements to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant and timely. If they do, well then they can try and achieve what's called goal congruence. They can try and make sure that the goals within the organisation are all working towards the same thing. So if we have employees that want to meet certain targets, well, those targets should fit in with the same as the management of the organisation, so that they're all working in the same direction and we haven't got different areas pulling in different directions. So there are some problems when we come to try and achieve goal congruence for our objectives within an organisation. First of all, how do we prioritise what are the most important objectives, the most important goals? Is that down to management? Is it down to the employees? How do we go about doing that prioritisation? We need to have some sort of a set criteria to do that. Also, we will always have conflicting organisation objectives. So we might find that our managers have different objectives from our employees. The employees might be seeking to get as much overtime as they can, for example, whereas management might be seeking to reduce overtime as much as they can to try and cut costs. So conflicting objectives within the organisation can mean that the organisation ultimately doesn't achieve the objectives that it expects to. Also, when it comes to these objectives, often they're hard to measure. If we're not just thinking about financial objectives where we can put a number on it, then it's difficult to say, well, did we meet that objective or did we not? So we need to have some sort of criteria in order to make it measurable when we come to our objectives. Also, a lot of our objectives can fall into the trap of being short-termist. So focusing on the short term rather than the long term. When we looked at what a strategy is, we said it's the long term direction or scope of the firm. Well, there's no room in there for short termism. So we need to be careful to set goals that are based on long term objectives rather than thinking about the short term goals of maybe managers in attaining bonuses, for example. Also, there's a problem in trying to satisfy everybody. Some goals simply will not be able to do this. If we set an objective of reducing overtime, as we mentioned, well, some employees are not going to like that. The managers may like it because they can reduce their costs, but the employees aren't going to like it because they're going to get paid less. So satisfying everybody will be a problem when we're setting objectives, but we need to try and get a balance between the best and the worst. So far then, with our external factors that the business will need to consider, we've looked at the mission. So they'll need to consider the mission of the organisation when they're setting the corporate strategy. And we've talked about the objectives that the company will have to set when they're setting that objective for their corporate strategy. Now I want to move on to look at something called social responsibility, corporate social responsibility. Now, corporate social responsibility is a little bit more than business ethics. This brings in all areas of the business. It seeks to ensure that the business acts in a responsible manner and considers all areas, be it ethics and also be it responsibility to the general public and to its employees. So it could be thought of as an ethical approach, but it's a little bit more than that. It's not just thinking about ethics, it's thinking about the welfare of its employees and the public and stakeholders. So sort of issues that we need to consider here, well, we need to think first of all about cultural variation. So there may be in different cultures, different levels of corporate social responsibility expected. So if you're thinking about this from an exam perspective, you need to think about the area in which the business is operating, and you need to think about the highest stances of ethical requirements that that business could take given that area that it's currently working in. Also, we need to consider that, for example, Friedman said the business of business is business, i.e. that the business is there to maximise shareholder wealth. Now, really, that doesn't quite fit in with corporate social responsibility. If we think, for example, from a financial management point of view, we simply think that the business is there to maximise shareholder wealth, to provide share price growth, and to provide dividends to those shareholders. Well, a lot of this corporate social responsibility that we look at will actually get in the way of that because we'll have different things to consider. For example, product safety. Keeping products safe may cost money. That may reduce shareholder wealth, but it's the right thing to do. It fits in with corporate social responsibility. Also, working conditions for our employees, particularly if we're thinking about employees that are working in countries that don't have proper legislation to require working conditions to be satisfactory. Well, should we spend extra money over and above the legal requirement to make those working conditions come up to scratch? Well, that doesn't fit in with maximising shareholder wealth, but under corporate social responsibility, you may decide that actually, yes, we should be doing that. Acting with honesty, well, we should always do that, but again, it may mean that we don't maximise shareholder wealth to the extent that we could have done. Considering the environment, so environmental issues, clean-up costs, etc. Well, do we clean up after the business, even if it's not legally required, simply to uphold this thought of corporate social responsibility? So there again, we wouldn't be maximising shareholder wealth. We'd actually be spending money that we could have returned to shareholders, but we would be thinking about the responsibility that that business has to the environment and to the public and stakeholders. We also need to think about areas like discrimination, using some of the funds within the business to actually make sure that there's no discrimination in the workplace, having a strong ethical code that our employees will all sign up to. And maybe charitable donations. Again, charitable donations don't maximise shareholder wealth, but it is something that a lot of businesses do and that most businesses will consider because it forms part of their corporate social responsibility. So when we're thinking about the ethical approaches that a business could take, there are different ethical stances that have been identified. The first ethical stance that a business could take is called the short-term shareholder interest. Now, this is simply looking at maximising profit. So this fits in with what we were talking about, maximising shareholder wealth. A business that undertakes this ethical stance will simply focus on building that business and maximising profit. They won't consider ethics beyond the legal minimum. So they'll comply with the legal minimum, for example, for health and safety in the workplace, but they won't go beyond that. They're simply interested in providing as much of a return as possible to shareholders in the short term. The second ethical stance is long-term shareholder interest. Now, this is pretty much the same as short-term shareholder interest, except it takes a bit of a longer view. So it will seek to maximise value, but again doesn't really seek to try and comply beyond the legal minimum. So it's more focused on providing a return to shareholders rather than thinking about the wider ethical requirements of the business. Moving on to multiple stakeholder obligation. Well, this is where we have businesses that involve stakeholders. So they'll take a little bit more of a wider view. They won't just focus on maximising shareholder wealth. They'll think about the stakeholders that they have within the organisation. They'll involve them and they'll go beyond the legal minimum to actually attempt to bring those stakeholders into the organisation in terms of considering their requirements and bringing them on board when making decisions. Lastly, the fourth of our ethical stances is a shaper of society. Now, this is a business that will take an ideological stance. So shapers of society actually think, right, let's maximise what we can give back to society. So they'll not only be trying to maximise shareholder wealth, they'll be trying to return that to society as a whole in terms of actually making a difference. So shapers of society will think about corporate social responsibility as one of the fundamental aims of the business. So there are some advantages to a business of actually doing this, of actually taking high regard to corporate social responsibility. It can mean that they get better staff because people will want to work for them. It can increase their advertising because they will be seen as a better business, as someone who's actually giving back to society. And that can ultimately increase the value of the business because people see it as a better business and therefore are better willing to do actually business with it, to actually work with them, to buy their products and to work with them as a business. So let's see how this can come up in a question form. So let's look at illustration 1 in your workbook for this lecture. In illustration 1, we're looking at corporate social responsibility with regards to a logging company. So make sure that you have read through the scenario. There's no point in doing the question if you haven't read the scenario. You might also want to pause the video, have a go at the question, and then work through the answer with me. Requirement 1 then, when we're looking at this illustration, is to briefly explain the differences between business ethics and corporate social responsibility. Now that's fairly straightforward, simply a discussion of both areas to highlight the differences, concentrating on corporate social responsibility because that's the area of the syllabus we're looking at here. So looking at this in detail, we could say that although the two terms business ethics and corporate social responsibility are often used interchangeably, it's wrong to do so. I mentioned in the lecture that business ethics is simply a component of corporate social responsibility. So business ethics could be defined as behaviour judged to be good, just, right, honourable, based on principles or guides from a specific ethical theory, whereas corporate social responsibility, much more broad, and we could define it as the continuing commitment for the business to behave ethically and contribute to the economic development whilst improving their quality of life for the workforce and their families. as well as the local community and society at large. So that's a detailed definition, and that's what we discussed when we looked at this area in the lecture, how that business impacts on society as a whole. So business ethics is only a component of corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility states that society can require a business to discharge its economic and legal duties. So that's thinking about maybe simply the short-term stakeholder interest theory, thinking about just discharging economic and legal duties. Also expecting a business to fulfill its ethical duties. Now that's moving more into an ideological stance. Also desiring a business to meet its social responsibilities, so making sure that it meets whatever responsibilities it has to the local people and the social area in which it operates. So that's the difference between our business ethics and our corporate social responsibility. Moving on then to requirement 2. So this tells us to discuss the corporate social responsibility issues relating to D's business and how the company might improve its corporate social responsibility position. The thing we need to be sure of here is to give enough detail to fully explain our points. Again, we're at a higher level. We need to make sure that when we're answering these questions, we're giving full amounts of detail. So, in the context of D's logging business, the chief executive has argued that the company always acts ethically since it has the agreement of the national government. However, this presupposes that the government itself is acting in the best interests of society, and that's not always the case. So with a logging business like this, it has the potential to create considerable environmental damage, especially in remote areas of the country. And therefore the possibility of unethical behaviour is high. We need to draw that out to make sure the examiner knows that we understand that that's the case for this specific type of business. So from a corporate social responsibility perspective, D needs to think carefully about its business practices if it's to continue with land-based logging. Ecological damage should be minimised, and once the logging has finished, as much as practicable should be done to restore the habitat to its previous condition. Well, we mentioned that in the lecture. Maybe thinking about expenditure that we don't necessarily have to entail, but it should be done in order to meet our corporate social responsibility. In the event that the areas in which it operates have a population, D should also be looking for ways to minimise the damage to the livelihoods and well-being of those people that live there. This could be done by providing educational facilities or offering training for those who have previously lived off the forests. So if we're damaging their way of life, well then we should try to make good that damage. If possible, D should consider replanting the area, so making sure that all of the trees that have been harvested are replanted, with appropriate trees to provide an element of sustainability. Taking a more global perspective, D could work with the environmental groups that have criticised them, so they have had some criticism from environmental groups. They could maybe try to work with those that have criticised them and could seek to conduct its logging in a sustainable forest. It could also take advice to ensure that it meets its environmental requirements and minimises its environmental impact. Lastly, having said this, remember, it shouldn't be forgotten that D is a commercial organisation and must continue to make the best sustainable profit for its shareholders. So there again we can see that play-off between its requirement to think socially through corporate social responsibility, but also its requirement to provide that return to its shareholders, because ultimately that's what a business is there to provide. The last of our considerations that we'll need to have when we're thinking about external factors that will affect our corporate strategy is the impact that stakeholders will have on the business. So stakeholders, I would define as anyone who has a legitimate interest in the business. So we need to take stakeholders' interests into account whenever we're trying to set our corporate strategy. So what we can do is we can decide how powerful these stakeholders are, and that's useful to try and decide how we should deal with those stakeholders. So we can undertake a stakeholder power analysis. So what that will do is give us an idea of how we should treat those stakeholders. It's a 5-step process. The first step is to identify the key stakeholders. So take a look widely within the organisation and outside the organisation and identify everyone who has a legitimate interest in the business. We then need to establish what that interest is and what claim they have on the business. For example, they may have an interest in what the business does, but they may not have any way to back it up. They may not have any power to actually determine what we do with that. So establish the interest and decide what claims they have within the business. Determine then their ability to influence the business. Are they powerful? What can they do if you decide not to do what they want? So determine their ability to influence the business to actually determine what happens within our business. Then identify any potential conflict. Not all stakeholders will want the same thing. So we need to make sure that we can identify where differing stakeholders will have differing objectives. And we can therefore try and set off any conflict and try and avoid that conflict if possible. Then we can attempt to minimize that conflict by simply knowing that it could come up and it could be a problem. So the groups in power that we'll come across will be, for example, staff. Now, staff will have perhaps unions which could be powerful. Those unions will want to make sure that there aren't redundancies, for example, to make sure that there are annual increases in pay and conditions. Also then, we need to make sure that the staff have a retained skill base. So we don't want to lose skilled staff to other organisations, for example. So they will be providing that skills base. So the important group will be the unions. The power that they will have is the skills base of the staff. When it comes to government, they will be interested in the organisation. They have a legitimate interest through the employment of the general population and also the tax that we will be paying to the government. So we'll have to comply with the regulations that they set, and we'll need to make sure that we can deal with any government interference in our business. When it comes to banks, of course, they will be a stakeholder. They may have provided us with loans, so we'll set loan terms. For example, they may set gearing ratios we can't go above. They may set restrictions on dividends that we need to consider in their loan terms. So they may be able to put pressure on us if we breach those terms, for example. So they will be quite powerful when it comes to being a group of stakeholders. Customers and suppliers, well, of course, these will be powerful. Customers, if we don't have customers, we don't have a business, so we definitely need to keep them happy. And when it comes to suppliers, well, we could be reliant on those suppliers to supply us with the raw materials we need to conduct business in the first place. So we need to be careful of alliances. We need to make sure that we deal directly with our customers and suppliers to ensure that they don't put pressure on us. Also, we can consider the volume that we buy from individual customers and suppliers. Is it beneficial to have several, or is it better to get volume discounts? So those are all sorts of groups and powers that there will be when we come to identify stakeholders. Mendelow said that we could then put this into a power interest matrix, which is as shown. So what we have here is the power on the left hand side, moving from low power at the top to high power at the bottom. The level of interest that those stakeholders will have, moving from low to high along the horizontal axis. And that will therefore decide how we actually deal with these stakeholders. So we identify our stakeholders, we analyse them to see what they want, and then we put them into this power interest matrix. So for example, if we have stakeholders that are high powered down at the bottom there, but have a low level of interest, well, all we need to do is keep those guys satisfied. They're not particularly interested. They may well become interested if we don't keep them satisfied, but so long as we keep them satisfied, that will be fine. What about those that have high power and high interest? Well, as identified, the bottom right-hand corner of our matrix, these are the key players. These are the ones we need to consider. These are the stakeholders that we need to deal with on an almost daily basis. We need to think about what they want. We need to think about how we can provide it. And we need to think about how we can keep them happy. Moving then to stakeholders who have low power. Well, if they have low power and low interest, well, that's our minimal effort in the top left. We don't need to do much for these guys because they don't have any power and they don't have much interest. so we don't have much effort to put into them. If they have low power but high interest, well, we need to keep them informed because they're interested, but they really can't do much if we don't do what they want. So they have low power, we'll simply keep them informed rather than pandering perhaps to the interest that they have. So often in the exam you'll be asked to put the stakeholders that you can identify into these various categories. Now there's no need to actually draw the matrix. We simply have 3 or 4 headings where we say the stakeholders who have high power and low interest, who are they? What do we need to do with them? Those with high power and high interest, who are they? What do we need to do with them? And so on until we've identified and dealt with all of the stakeholders. So you don't need to draw out this matrix, but you do need to put a heading for each of those different categories and be able to say how you're going to deal with those stakeholders. That's very important, and we'll look at an example towards the end where we actually go ahead and do that. Once we have identified our stakeholders, we know their power, we know their interest, we need to think about how we deal with the relationship that we have with those stakeholders. So managing our relationship will be important. We need to do, first of all, things like establishing responsibility and a budget for stakeholder management. So we may set someone in charge of that. We'll say, look, you're in charge with managing our relationship with this particular stakeholder. We have a budget for that, and that will involve us actually deciding what we're going to do to manage that relationship. So for example, we might target conflict areas. We might say, look, this is something that this stakeholder wants. We're not going to be able to provide it. So we need to manage that relationship. We need to inform that stakeholder as to why we're not going to be able to do what they want. In that way, we can avoid conflict with stakeholders, especially those stakeholders who are powerful. If there's not much power in the stakeholders, we want to keep them informed, but we won't be much interested in actually providing them with solutions if that's not in the interests of our firm. We may also meet with the groups involved. So if we have stakeholders, we may well meet with those groups to actually make sure we're managing the relationship satisfactorily. Also, if we have conflict with our stakeholders, how are we going to deal with that? Well, there are some ways that we can deal with conflict resolution. For example, satisficing. Now, satisficing simply means that we come to a compromise with those stakeholders. Now, that will apply more to stakeholders who have reasonably high power, because we'll need to actually come to a compromise with those stakeholders. As opposed to our sequential attention, for example. Now, sequential attention means that we simply give attention to our stakeholder by turn. So we take turns, we give attention to one stakeholder, then we turn to the next stakeholder and we provide those guys with attention. Or we could take side payments, i.e. we could take appeasement approach. So we don't maybe give the stakeholders everything they want, but we could give them a little bit. So we give a little bit, we appease the stakeholder, and that should resolve the conflict. Or we could simply exercise our power. So in deadlock, if we simply can't come to a solution with those different stakeholders, well, we'll maybe have to just exercise that power, and we'll just have to say, this is the way we're doing it, and you don't have any choice in that matter. So that's how we're going to deal with the relationship with our stakeholders. There are some other considerations like non-market strategies. This is a strategy for how we deal with people who aren't involved in the market. For example, the government. So the government aren't involved in the market, but they are a key stakeholder in the organisation. There are different areas that we need to be aware of that the government could affect the business in. For example, new regulations. So what can we do with them? Well, we need to try and foresee their actions. We need to keep informed on what the government is thinking, what their policy is likely to be, if that policy is going to affect the business. Or, for example, non-governmental organisations, we may well work with these charities, for example, who have an interest in what we're doing. Well, it's advantageous to us to work with those non-government organisations to make sure that our interests are upheld. Also, the media and society as a whole. There's nothing worse for a business than poor media coverage. They'll want to manage their reputation. They want to make sure that they're perceived in the best possible light. So they need to have a media strategy, a social strategy for upholding their reputation in the community at large. So they need to think about how they're perceived by the outside in order to do that. Just thinking about the government and how a business might influence government policy. There is such thing as lobbying, so large businesses will often lobby the government for things that they want or require. So they'll try to influence the government and decisions that that government will make, either by providing them with information that actually sheds light on an area that the government may not understand, or simply by putting pressure on them for an area that they don't want actually to come into force. To ensure this, they may well have ex-MPs as non-executive directors, so ex-members of parliament as non-executive directors, and that may well enable them to influence public opinion. If the organisation feels that the government are not doing what they want and that the government is doing something that could be detrimental to the business, well, they may well try to influence public opinion to try to put pressure on the government. For example, in Australia, the government was going to implement a harsh tax on mining companies because they were seen to be earning too much money. So the mining companies put pressure on the government by undertaking an advertising campaign to influence public opinion that the mining companies were bringing employment, for example, that they were actually something that was good for Australia and that they shouldn't be taxed in this way. So that can influence public opinion, put pressure on the government and uphold the interests of the business. So let's look at illustration 2, which deals in detail with stakeholders and stakeholder analysis. In illustration 2, we're looking at a stakeholder analysis. So the first requirement is to explain the advantages to E of conducting a stakeholder analysis of its operations in country F. Well, we just need to make sure we fully explain what these benefits are. So let's look at what the benefits could be. Well, although it appears that E has a relatively small group of stakeholders, so there aren't that many of them, it would be in the interests of the board of directors to determine both the power and interest of each group and the relationships between them. That's what a stakeholder analysis does for the business. Any strategy that E tries to pursue in the negotiations with the government must ideally have the agreement and preferably the active support of the more powerful stakeholders, so we'll need to identify who they are in order to do that. In the event that there's an insufficient support among those stakeholders, the strategy proposed may well fail. So we need to understand that stakeholders can be powerful and can have a detrimental effect on strategies if they don't support them. It's very likely that this will happen since on first consideration the stakeholders seem to have vastly differing views, so there's likely to be disagreement, particularly on multinationals. So with that in mind, E should determine which stakeholder groups will have the greater capacity to disrupt the plans made by the organisations. So they need to think about who is going to have the most power to actually influence what they do, and they'll then need to deal with them in the ways that we talked about in the lecture. So they need to establish the power and interests of the various groups so that it can decide whether to accommodate, negotiate, manipulate or resist the claims of the various groups. So that's the benefits that they will take from actually conducting the stakeholder analysis. Part 2 then asks us to produce a stakeholder analysis. So we know what this is, we know we can now break it down into the different categories using our power interest matrix. So let's go ahead and do that. First of all, looking at stakeholders that are powerful and interested. So these are ones that we will really need to consider. So number 1, the government of country F is powerful because it could impose more stringent operating conditions on the business. Also, it would most likely have the support of the opposition party in Parliament to do so, because we see that they're all quite hostile to multinationals, or well, the opposition are. Although the current government is business friendly, it does seem that it's taking a strong stance in its negotiations with E, and that's because there's an election soon, and its position's pretty weak in that election. So you need to pull all of that information out of that illustration to really get to the bottom of why the government will be interested in its dealings with E. Secondly then, we have the opposition party. Now, they're a powerful stakeholder because the party in power has a relatively small majority. So that means we may well find that the opposition party could come to power in the near future. It also has the cooperation of the National Labour Union, which again makes it more powerful, and its interest will be strong. It can also be considered hostile because it might see this as an opportunity to become the government by taking a strong stance against the business. Also, the National Labour Union will be powerful and interested because it has a close relationship with the opposition party. Also, we have a relatively weak government in power, so that makes the Labour Union more powerful. So its interest could be described as hostile because its stated intention is the removal of all multinationals from the country. So that would indicate that this is a powerful and interested body, someone we'd need to take note of. The other multinationals operating in country F are also powerful in that some of them are competitors. If the relationship between E and the farmers deteriorates, they will capitalise on the situation. So they will maybe take over those cooperatives, for example. They will temper this by ensuring that all multinationals are not legislated against. So okay, they are powerful and interested, but they won't want to see too much damage being done to E because they may worry that that will happen to all multinationals in the country because it does look like there's a bit of hostility there towards multinationals in general. So those are the groups that are powerful and interested. If you came up with other ones, that's fine, as long as you justified through your discussion why you said that they were powerful and interested. Moving on to those that are powerful but have a low interest. Well, the first of these is the shareholders of E. They will be powerful, of course, but their interest is generally relatively low unless the impact of the loss of the source of supply will have a significant effect on profits. So until they start seeing an impact on shareholder return, then they're generally not that interested. But they are powerful. So other than those shareholders who have a particular interest in ethical issues, this local event is unlikely to have much of an impact on their thoughts. So what's going on locally probably won't impact on those shareholders. Thinking about those then with low power but a high interest. Well, first of all, we'll have the farmers. Now, they have relatively little power in this situation because they're dependent on E or one of the other multinationals because someone has to buy their crops. So they're reliant on someone buying those crops, so they have relatively little power. They're obviously, though, extremely interested in the outcome since they currently enjoy a good working relationship with E, and they do get considerable support from E at the current time. So they're highly interested, but with relatively little power. So we need to keep them informed, but generally speaking, they won't have much power to wield in this situation. Number 2, we have the farm workers. Now, they also have high interest, but limited power to influence the situation. They're dependent on the farmers for their wages, so they are interested, of course, and they're therefore dependent on the success of those farmers in dealing with E. Similarly to the farmers, were E to leave the country and the cooperatives disbanded, as has been purported, they would probably have reduced standard of living because they simply wouldn't be getting the money that they expected to get. Lastly, we have the OECD. Now, the OECD will be interested in the outcome of these negotiations, as it has recognised that E, which is a global player, is an example of good practice. So it would like to see E continue to do what it's doing, to operate in the way it currently does, so that it continue to use it as an example. So the OECD will be interested, but will have relatively little power. So in the event that the company starts to make concessions, the OECD may not be happy with the situation and therefore may be annoyed with E for doing it. But there's not much they can do about it because they have relatively low power. So again, don't worry if your identification took a different course than that, if you identified different bodies as low power and high interest or vice versa. As long as you can justify what you come up with, you will get your marks. But that's how we conduct a stakeholder analysis, and those are the different categories that we need to look at when we're doing so. That then was our lecture on external factors that can influence our corporate strategy. Make sure you understand all of the areas in here before moving on to our further lectures.